Their first word wasn't mama or dada, it was laughter. Pure, real, uncontrollable. And it was directed at a man who should never have been on their property. A man who, somehow, gave them what millions couldn't: the safety to speak, the courage to stand. The reason to begin. The security cameras caught every frame. But not even the clearest footage could explain the impossible. Liam and Theodore, for an entire year, had been medical mysteries. No diagnoses, no progress, no hope. The world's finest neurologists had whispered about trauma, chromosomal anomalies, spectrum disorders. And yet the boys. Test results came back flawless. Again and again. They sat silent in therapy. Stared blankly at toys. Never responded to touch. Never uttered a sound. Until today. Until him. Carlo Gambino, dressed like sin at a funeral, crouched in their hydrangea-trimmed yard, smiling like he knew something no one else ever had. Like he wasn't just watching a miracle, but had caused it. Mathew's hand twitched toward his phone. A lifetime of instinct screamed to call security, to erase this man from his world. But he couldn't look away. Theodore had climbed into Carlo's arms, babbling nonsense syllables like sacred scripture. Liam, once frozen by silence, was pointing at the sky. Laughing. Laughing. The same boys who hadn't made a sound in 12 months were now singing, in their own way, to a man Mathew hadn't seen in over a decade. The last time Carlo had stood this close to Mathew's family, there was blood on the carpet and a contract in fireproof ink. But now, there was only grass, sunlight, 2 babies, and the beginning of something Mathew couldn't explain. Clarissa, their mother, stood at the top of the marble steps, hands over her mouth, sobbing. Mathew turned slowly, as if waking up underwater. Did they just? They spoke, Clarissa whispered. They walked. Mathew looked back at Carlo. The man hadn't moved, hadn't said a word, just watched the boys with something that looked disturbingly like tenderness. This wasn't therapy, this was something older, deeper, dangerous. But to understand how we got here, to understand why a mafia boss became the first person Mathew's sons ever trusted, we need to go back to where it all began. Before we begin, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. The Francis mansion had always been immaculate. Its marble floors reflecting the morning light like water, its corridors lined with art no one ever looked at. But lately the silence had become unbearable. Even the maids whispered, afraid to disturb the stillness that had taken root after the twins were born. Mathew Francis ruled his empire the same way he ruled his home, through control, precision, and silence. Every movement, every meal, every breath inside that mansion seemed to exist on his schedule, under his gaze, and within the boundaries of his expectations. Mathew hadn't always been this way. There was a time when he had been a hungry young man from the East Side, fixing broken elevators and dreaming of skyscrapers that would carry his name. Poverty had taught him one thing: noise was weakness. The men who shouted were the ones ignored. The men who stayed quiet were the ones feared. When he finally climbed high enough to buy silence, he never gave it back. His entire life was built around the illusion that stillness meant strength. That illusion cracked the day his sons were born. Liam first, crying once before falling strangely quiet. Theodore next, opening his eyes but making no sound at all. Doctors said they were healthy, strong, even exceptional. Mathew didn't see a problem, he saw potential. Quiet boys grow into powerful men, he told Clarissa that first night, while she lay pale and trembling in her hospital bed. She only nodded, unsure whether he was reassuring her or himself. The nursery reflected Mathew's obsession. White walls, silver cribs, toys arranged by color and size. More a showroom than a place for laughter. Every morning, the staff followed an exact routine. Temperature, 72 degrees. Lighting, warm white. No cartoons, no loud music, no clutter. Clarissa had suggested painting clouds on the ceiling once, but Mathew's expression had silenced her faster than any argument could. By the twins' 6th month, Clarissa began to notice the unease. They didn't reach for toys. They didn't babble or coo. Their blue eyes were clear, alert even, but empty. They would track movement like cameras, but not react. Sometimes, when she held them, it felt like hugging reflections of herself rather than sons. Clarissa started keeping a journal, private, leather-bound, hidden in the drawer of her dressing table. She wrote about everything the doctors refused to acknowledge. The way Liam flinched at loud noises, the way Theodore stared through people instead of at them, the way both boys seemed to shrink from touch. "They don't cry," she wrote one night. "They just observe, like they're waiting for permission to exist." Mathew's solution was precision, as always. He hired specialists from Switzerland, therapists from Tokyo, and a private neurologist who had once worked with royalty. They ran scans, measured reflexes, monitored sleep patterns. Each report ended the same way: no physical abnormalities detected. The conclusion, unspoken but understood, was damning. Whatever was wrong wasn't in their bodies. It was in their home. Clarissa tried to tell him. "They need warmth, Mathew. Laughter. Noise." But Mathew had built his life on avoiding both. "What they need," he said, "is stability. Discipline." He believed love meant control, and control meant silence. It was how he had conquered every weakness in himself, every trace of the boy who once went to bed hungry and woke to the sound of his parents fighting. He didn't realize he was passing that silence on. The staff tiptoed through the mansion like ghosts. Nannies came and went, unable to bear the eerie calm of children who never cried. Meals were served and cleared away uneaten. Even the family dog, a golden retriever named Winston, stopped barking after a while, curling up quietly outside the nursery door, as if waiting for something that never came. The mansion, for all its beauty, felt more like a museum than a home. Clarissa tried everything: singing, storytelling, silly faces. But the twins only blinked in unison, like synchronized mirrors. Once, she played an old record of Italian lullabies, her mother's favorite. For a second, Theodore's lips trembled, as though something deep inside recognized the melody. But then Mathew walked in, phone pressed to his ear, and the moment vanished. He didn't notice the record at all. That night, Clarissa wrote in her journal again. "He doesn't see them," she confessed in careful handwriting. "He sees himself, what he wants them to be. They're suffocating under his perfection." She closed the book and stared at the nursery through the glass wall. The twins lay side by side, awake but still, their matching gray onesies blending with the sheets. Two small statues carved from the same quiet marble as their father. Mathew didn't read the journal, but he didn't need to. He saw Clarissa's exhaustion in the way she avoided him. He saw the way she lingered at the nursery door, as though afraid to enter. But instead of reaching for her, he buried himself in work. The Francis Corporation was expanding into European markets, and distraction was easier than reflection. Every deal signed was another reason not to look too closely at the cracks forming at home. The twins' first birthday arrived with cameras and catering, not laughter. The event planner had called it an elegant celebration of legacy. There were white roses, gold balloons, and a 3-tiered cake that cost more than a teacher's salary. The photographers smiled, coaxing reactions from the children. None came. Liam blinked. Theodore yawned. Not one smile, not one giggle. When the candles were lit, both boys stared into the flames as if mesmerized by their stillness. Later that night, the house was silent again. The staff had gone home, the guests, laughter had faded, and the scent of champagne lingered faintly in the air. Clarissa sat on the floor of the nursery, her dress still wrinkled from the party. The twins lay in their cribs, eyes open but distant. "They don't even dream," she whispered. Mathew stood in the doorway, helpless for once, his shadow falling long across the white carpet. He wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how. Every gesture felt foreign, every word too heavy. He reached out, then withdrew his hand before touching her shoulder. Clarissa turned to him, tears streaking her makeup. "They're not broken, Mathew," she said. "They're lonely." He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came. The silence between them said everything. That night, Clarissa fell asleep in the nursery chair, the twins, quiet breathing, filling the space where laughter should have been. Mathew retreated to his study, where the hum of the city felt safer than the weight of his wife's words. He poured a drink, stared at the empire he had built across the skyline, and told himself he'd fix it tomorrow. But somewhere deep down, he knew the truth. He didn't know how. Outside, Rain began to fall, soft but relentless. It tapped against the tall windows, a rhythm no one listened to. At midnight, a security guard buzzed Mathew's intercom. "Sir, there's a delivery for you. No sender listed." Mathew frowned but told them to bring it in. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, sealed with black wax. He broke it open without hesitation. Inside was a single card. No logo, no letterhead. Just 6 words written in sharp, slanted handwriting. "I'm coming for what you owe me." Beneath it, 2 initials. C.G. Mathew read it twice, before the whiskey slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. For the first time in years, he felt something that silence could not contain. Fear. Real, living fear. He stood there for a long time, staring at the card, while thunder rolled distantly across the city like a warning. In the nursery upstairs, the twins stirred in their sleep. Theodore whimpered softly, barely audible. Liam's tiny hand reached across the crib rail, finding his brother's fingers. They didn't speak. But for the first time, they moved. And in the quiet house of the Francis family, something unseen shifted, an awakening that began not with sound, but with silence itself. It was barely past 9 when the security breach alert buzzed across the Francis estate's internal network. Cameras focused in on the long front drive, lined with manicured hedges and trimmed silence. A single man walked through the gate as if he owned it. No escort, no announcement, no hesitation. He wore a black suit, sharp as a blade, and a wide-brimmed fedora that cast his face in shadow. Calm, cold, magnetic. Inside the mansion, chaos stirred. The head of security barked orders into his radio, while 3 men converged on the control room. Unidentified male. No scheduled appointment. Advancing on the main entry, the footage played on screen. No weapon in sight, no aggression, just a man moving with deliberate, unsettling ease. Staff froze. Clarissa looked up from the breakfast table and caught Mathew's expression the moment he saw the face on the monitor. Mathew didn't blink. He didn't speak. He simply stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the front door. "Stand down," he told the guards through gritted teeth. "Sir?" they asked, confused. "You heard me. No guns, no interference." The silence in his voice carried more weight than a command ever could. When Mathew stepped outside, the sun had just broken through the trees, casting long shadows across the stone path. The man was already halfway up the drive, hands in his coat pockets, expression unreadable. For a moment, neither spoke. It wasn't fear that filled the air. It was memory. And something heavier. "You aged well, Maddie," the man finally said, his voice wrapped in gravel and old cigarettes. "Money suits you." "Carlo," Mathew said, the name tasting bitter. "You're not supposed to be here." "I've never been good at obeying signs," Carlo replied, "especially ones put up by men who forgot who helped build the gate." Mathew glanced over his shoulder. Clarissa was watching from the window, twins still out of sight. "You're trespassing." Carlo smiled faintly. "Let's not pretend you didn't know I'd come eventually." Mathew's jaw tightened. "If this is about what happened in Chicago," Carlo cut him off with a look sharp enough to slice steel. "Don't insult me. This isn't about business. It's about a debt." Mathew's silence answered for him. Carlo nodded once. "Good. Then you remember." They stood 10 feet apart on the lush green lawn, 2 men who had once shared blood pacts and boardroom betrayals. Carlo removed his fedora, ran a hand through his dark hair, and looked up at the mansion. "Nice house. Better than the one we nearly died building." Mathew said nothing. "You told me. Anything you want, just help me survive." Carlo's tone dropped. "Well, I'm here, and I don't want money." Mathew's fists clenched. "Why now?" His voice cracked under the surface. "Why them?" Carlo didn't flinch. "Because you owe me a soul. And it turns out you made 2. Mathew felt the air press against him like a wall. "You stay away from my sons." Carlo's eyebrow lifted. "I already met them." "You what?" Carlo turned his gaze toward the side yard. "Just now, back by the pines. They were watching the wind move the branches." He paused. Didn't blink, didn't smile, like tiny statues. Mathew's face paled. "You talked to them?" "No," Carlo said softly. I just stood there, let the silence stretch. And? Mathew asked. They moved, Carlo said, like it meant everything. They followed the sound of my shoes in the grass. Mathew's mouth opened, then closed. No therapist, no doctor, no nanny had ever described anything remotely close. The twins barely acknowledged anyone, except each other. You came to collect? Mathew asked finally. No, Carlo replied. I came to see if there's anything left worth saving. Clarissa opened the door then, her voice soft but firm. Mathew? Who is this? He didn't turn. An old associate. Carlo looked up at her and tipped his hat. Pleasure, Mrs. Francis. She offered a nod, cautious and graceful. The kind of woman who knew how to read a room in a single glance. Mathew stepped aside slightly. You have 1 hour. Under surveillance, I assume, Carlo said dryly. You assume right, Carlo smirked. Fair enough. I'm not here to disappear with your fortune. No, Mathew said under his breath, just with my sins. They walked side by side into the backyard, the weight between them years thick. Neither man spoke. Carlo's steps were slower now, not from age but from respect. Like he knew the ground beneath him mattered more than the marble halls he passed through. The yard was immaculate, too perfect. Hedges symmetrical, not a leaf out of place. And yet, it was lifeless. No toys, no laughter, just beauty trapped in glass. Carlo looked toward the shaded patio, where the twins sat in high chairs, blankly staring at nothing. Clarissa watched them cautiously. Mathew kept his distance, close enough to intervene but far enough to pretend he wasn't watching everything. Carlo approached with slow reverence, crouching to meet their eye level. He didn't reach out. He didn't speak. He just waited. The twins blinked. Then Theodore turned his head, just slightly. Carlo tilted his in response. A quiet acknowledgement passed between them, invisible and immediate. Liam's fingers twitched, tapping his chair in rhythm with a soft breeze. Carlo hummed under his breath, an old Sicilian tune, broken and sweet. The boys tilted toward the sound, like flowers toward sunlight. Mathew couldn't breathe. His heart thundered in his chest. What are you doing? He whispered harshly. Listening, Carlo replied. For the first time in a long time, someone needs to. Clarissa stepped forward, stunned. They're responding. Carlo smiled without pride. They're not broken, Mrs. Francis. They're waiting. For the next 40 minutes, Carlo stayed crouched, never touching them, never pushing. He hummed, whistled, spoke softly in Italian. At one point, Liam let out a sound, half cough, half giggle, and Clarissa dropped into a chair, trembling. Theodore tapped the rhythm of Carlo's breath on the table, matching it beat for beat. When the hour passed, Carlo stood slowly, joints cracking from the crouch. He turned to Mathew. This wasn't a visit, he said. It was proof. Of what? Mathew asked. That what you've been building, Carlo nodded toward the mansion, means nothing if no one inside it knows how to live. Mathew said nothing. Clarissa stood beside him, hand on his arm, stunned into silence. Carlo tipped his hat again. You want to fix this? You know where to find me. Same number, same name. He turned and walked away, past the pool, past the garden, and out the front gates, without a glance back. Mathew stared at the twins. They were still, silent, but not empty. Something flickered there now, something even money couldn't buy. And for the first time, Mathew wondered if Carlo hadn't come for revenge, but to return something long lost. What would you do if the only person your children responded to was the one man you'd spent your life trying to keep out? Let us know in the comments. Should Mathew trust Carlo again? Or is the price of redemption too high? The next morning arrived like any other at the Francis estate, polished, predictable, and painfully quiet. The gardeners trimmed hedges that didn't need trimming. The staff whispered through hallways where sound always seemed forbidden. But in the backyard, beneath the polished perfection and sculpted silence, something unusual was about to unfold. Clarissa had taken the twins outside for their morning sunlight, more out of routine than hope. They sat in their matching gray onesies, unmoving as always, tiny statues in a kingdom too quiet to be alive. Clarissa settled onto the balcony with a glass of white wine, though it was barely past noon. She watched them, as she always did, half hoping, half grieving. The doctor's last report still echoed in her head. No physiological abnormalities detected. It should have been good news. Instead, it felt like a curse, proof that her children's silence wasn't a mystery medicine could solve. Mathew wasn't home. Meetings, mergers, anything to stay away from the unbearable stillness that clung to their home. So Clarissa didn't hear the gate creak open, didn't see the black car idling at the edge of the estate. By the time Carlo Gambino walked through the yard, the staff had already learned from the previous visit not to interfere. His presence wasn't an intrusion, it was gravity. The kind that pulled attention without asking. He was dressed the same as before, black suit, black shirt, no tie, the fedora shadowing his eyes. But this time, he carried something small in his hand. A wooden box, smooth and aged, carved with delicate patterns that shimmered when sunlight touched them. He set it gently on the ground beside him and knelt, ignoring the manicured path that demanded people keep their shoes clean. Carlo never obeyed rules that didn't make sense. The twins sat in their usual place on the grass, backs straight, hands resting motionless on their knees. They stared at nothing, as though the world was a picture they hadn't yet decided to look at. Carlo crouched a few feet away, silent at first. He studied them the way a sculptor studies marble, searching for the life beneath the surface. Then, softly, he began to hum. It wasn't a song meant for children. It was older, heavier. The notes wound through the air like smoke curling from an unseen fire. A Sicilian lullaby, half memory, half prayer. The melody was rough at the edges, but warm, the kind of tune meant to be carried on a mother's breath. It reached the twins before they knew what it was. For a long moment, nothing happened. The only movement was the sway of the trees and the glint of sunlight on Carlo's ring. Then Theodore blinked. Once. Twice. Slowly, his head turned toward the sound, the faintest frown of curiosity creasing his tiny brow. Liam's fingers twitched on the grass, his body shifting forward almost unconsciously. Clarissa froze, wine glass hovering midair. Carlo's humming deepened, low and rhythmic. The music box in his hands clicked open, and a soft chime joined the melody, a mechanical heartbeat keeping time with the song. It was the sound of something ancient wrapped in something fragile. The twins, heads tilted in unison, their eyes met his. For the first time, recognition flickered there. Clarissa's heart skipped. The glass slipped from her fingers, crashing against the marble railing and scattering shards across the balcony. She didn't even notice. Down below, the impossible was happening. Liam and Theodore were moving. Not crawling with purpose, not walking with control, but inching forward in unsteady rhythm. Their tiny palms pressed into the grass, as if trying to feel the vibration of the song itself. Carlo didn't move. He kept humming, letting the tune do what words never could. He whispered something in Italian, his voice steady and reverent. La musica trova l'anima, he said. Music finds the soul. His tone wasn't a command, it was a reminder. As if the twins already knew what to do, they just needed someone to give them permission to remember. Theodore's hand reached the edge of the music box first. He tapped it, then tapped again, the same rhythm Carlo was humming. Liam followed, a moment later, his small hands clapping together once, then again. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. And that was more than anyone had ever seen them be. Clarissa's breath came out in a single shuddering gasp. Carlo smiled, not the cruel smile of a man who'd won something, but the quiet, knowing smile of someone who'd found what he came looking for. Bravi, he whispered. Good boys. The twins, heads lifted at the sound. They babbled, soft broken sounds that didn't form words but carried intention. Theodore laughed once, high-pitched and startlingly bright. The sound cut through the stillness like the first crack in a long winter. From the window inside, one of the maids pressed a hand over her mouth, whispering, My God, they're laughing. She wasn't wrong. The impossible had begun. The twins clapped again, louder this time, their little hands finding rhythm. Liam stumbled forward onto his knees, lost balance, and toppled into Theodore, who squealed. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't perfect. It was miraculous. Carlo reached out, but didn't touch them. Piano, piano, he murmured, his voice soft as the wind. Slowly, little ones. They froze, blinking at him as though listening to a command from somewhere older than language. Clarissa finally moved, racing down the staircase barefoot, her pulse thundering in her ears. When she reached the yard, her knees nearly gave out. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, she almost didn't believe it was real. Carlo stood as she approached. The twins looked between them, their attention flickering like candlelight between two flames. Clarissa fell to her knees, trembling. What did you do?" she whispered. Carlo shook his head, nothing. He gestured toward the open box, still playing its gentle tune. "They remember, even if you don't." Clarissa blinked through tears. "Remember what?" "The language that comes before words," Carlo said simply. "Every child is born with it, but some need silence to hear it again." He turned to the twins, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "And some silence is too heavy for them to carry alone." The music box wound down, its song slowing into a heartbeat rhythm. The twins reached for it as if unwilling to let it stop. Liam's tiny fingers brushed Carlo's hand. The man stilled, glancing down, surprised by the contact. "Ah," he said softly, "so you do feel." He closed the lid gently and looked up at Clarissa. "Now we begin." Mathew arrived home 15 minutes later, briefcase still in hand, unaware that his world had already shifted. From the driveway, he heard laughter, soft, uneven, but unmistakable. He froze, his mind struggling to process the sound. It couldn't be them, not his sons, not after a year of nothing. He rushed inside, ignoring the startled staff, and followed the sound like a man chasing a ghost. When he reached the yard, the scene before him nearly brought him to his knees. The twins were sitting upright in the grass, their faces glowing with joy, while Carlo crouched before them, still as stone. Clarissa knelt beside the boys, tears streaming freely. "There, Mathew, there—" She couldn't finish. Liam clapped again, laughing when Theodore echoed the sound. Mathew's throat tightened. "What's happening?" he demanded, but his voice cracked halfway through. Carlo glanced up, calm as ever. "They remembered how to live," he said simply. "You should try it sometime." Mathew took a step forward, but Clarissa caught his sleeve. "Don't," she whispered. "You'll break it." Carlo reached for the music box, winding it once more. The melody filled the air again, softer now, carrying something like peace. The twins leaned in, humming sounds that weren't quite words, but weren't random either. Mathew's heart clenched as he realized the truth. They were communicating. Not just reacting, but responding. Carlo looked over at him, eyes steady. "You think silence is strength, Mr. Francis?" he said. "But silence without love is just emptiness dressed in power." Mathew said nothing. For the first time in years, he didn't have an answer, a defense, or a deal to offer. He just watched as the man he'd once feared most made his children feel something he couldn't. The sun began to set, painting the mansion in shades of gold. The twins grew quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of silence. This one was full, filled with breath, warmth, and the memory of laughter. Clarissa wiped her face, still kneeling beside them. Carlo stood and placed the music box in her hands. "Keep it," he said. "They'll know when to use it again." As he turned to leave, Mathew finally found his voice. "Why are you doing this?" Carlo didn't look back. "Because once, someone did it for me." He paused at the gate, tipping his hat. "You build towers, Maddie. I build people. Maybe it's time we see which lasts longer." Then he disappeared down the path, leaving nothing behind but the faint echo of a lullaby and two boys who had finally learned to listen. That night, the Francis mansion didn't feel so silent anymore. The next morning arrived heavy with questions that no one dared to ask out loud. Clarissa sat in the breakfast room, her coffee untouched, the porcelain cup trembling slightly in her hand. The twins were in the nursery, quietly napping after what had been the most extraordinary day of their young lives. The echo of their laughter still lingered in the halls, unreal and fragile, like a dream that might fade if spoken aloud. But beneath that fragile miracle, fear simmered, because the man who had made it happen was not supposed to exist in their world. When Mathew walked into the room, his tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot. Clarissa didn't rise to greet him. She had been waiting for him all night, her thoughts running in tight, endless circles. "Who is he?" she asked quietly. "Who is this man who walks into our life, hums a song, and makes our sons do what science couldn't. Mathew froze mid-step, his jaw tightening. He didn't answer immediately, and the silence that followed was an answer of its own. Clarissa set down her cup, her voice sharp now. Don't tell me he's just an old friend. Don't tell me this is a coincidence. She rose to her feet, crossing the room until she was standing inches from him. You knew him. You've always known him. Mathew exhaled, long and slow, then sank into the nearest chair. Yes, he said finally. I knew him. A long time ago. Clarissa waited, arms crossed, the morning light cutting across her face like glass. Start talking, she said. Mathew rubbed a hand across his face, his voice low, almost a confession. 15 years ago, I was not the man you know now. I was desperate, buried under debts, cornered by competitors who wanted to erase me from the industry. And Carlo Gambino, he hesitated on the name, was the only man who offered help when everyone else turned their backs. Clarissa frowned. Help? From him? Mathew nodded. It wasn't supposed to go that far. He arranged financing through channels I never asked too many questions about. He removed people who stood in the way of my first development deal, people who might have destroyed everything I was building. His voice dropped lower. And I told him if he ever needed anything at all, I'd owe him. Clarissa stared, horrified. So you sold a favor to the Mafia to buy your empire? It wasn't supposed to be like that, Mathew said quickly, almost pleading. It was survival. I had nothing. I thought it was just business. He leaned back, the weight of his past pressing into his shoulders. When the deal closed, I told Carlo, anything you want, just help me survive this. He laughed and said, Careful, Maddie. Some debts live longer than money. Clarissa's stomach turned as realization began to form like a storm. So what did you promise him? Mathew hesitated before answering. My firstborn, he said finally. I promised him godfather rights. It was symbolic. A gesture, nothing more. I never thought I'd have to honor it. Clarissa took a step back, one hand pressed to her mouth. You promised him our children? Mathew stood abruptly. I didn't know then. And it was never meant literally. It was just a deal, Clarissa finished bitterly. And now he's here to collect. Before Mathew could respond, a knock echoed from the foyer. Steady, deliberate, familiar. Clarissa's pulse spiked. Mathew turned toward the door, every muscle in his body tensing. When the butler opened it, Carlo stood there, hat in hand, his dark eyes glinting beneath the morning sun. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like inevitability. Good morning, Carlo said, his tone polite, measured. I hope I'm not interrupting family time. You have no right to be here, Clarissa said immediately. You had your hour yesterday. Whatever game this is. It's not a game, Carlo interrupted softly. And I didn't come to take anything. He stepped forward, uninvited yet unchallenged, and set a small paper bag on the marble table near the entrance. Breakfast, he said with a faint smile. For the boys. Real food, not whatever powdered luxury your chef prepares. Clarissa blinked, speechless at his audacity. Mathew stepped between them. You think walking in here like this is acceptable? You think I'll just... Carlo cut him off again, calm as ever. I came to remind you of what you once promised, Maddie. But I didn't come to collect it. His tone softened. I came to heal what your money couldn't. Mathew's anger faltered for a fraction of a second before returning like a blade. Heal? You mean manipulate? Carlo's smirk was almost kind. If I wanted to manipulate, your empire would already belong to me. I could have taken everything years ago. Your properties, your partners, even your name. He adjusted his cufflinks, unbothered. But that's not what I want. His gaze drifted toward the nursery door. I only want one thing. Clarissa instinctively stepped closer to the twins, her voice trembling. And what is that? Carlo's eyes softened. 1 hour, he said. Every Thursday. That's all I ask. Mathew stared at him, incredulous. To do what? Teach them Italian? Whisper family secrets. Carlo's smile vanished, replaced by something serious. To teach them to feel, he said. Something you seem to have forgotten how to do. The insult cut deeper than Mathew expected, because it was true. He had built walls so high, even his children couldn't see over them. Clarissa looked between the two men, one who had given her everything, and one who had somehow given her sons more. Her instincts screamed to protect, to refuse, but her heart whispered something else entirely. She had seen what Carlo did yesterday. No one could fake that, not even a man like him. She turned to Mathew, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should let him try." Mathew's expression hardened. "You can't be serious." Clarissa took his hand, her tone quiet but unwavering. "I am. The doctors couldn't help, the therapists couldn't. Whatever he did, it worked." Mathew shook his head. "At what cost?" Clarissa's gaze flicked toward the nursery, where faint giggles echoed. "Maybe the cost is trusting someone you hate," she said softly. "For once." Carlo watched the exchange, his face unreadable. "She's right," he said finally. "This isn't about you or me, Maddie. It's about them." He pointed toward the closed nursery door. "You built towers from steel and glass. I build connection. That's the only currency that never collapses." Mathew met his gaze, old resentment rising like smoke. "You think you can waltz in here, play savior, and fix what you don't understand?" Carlo's tone stayed even. "I don't need to understand them. I just need to see them." His eyes flicked toward Clarissa. "And right now, I see two children who are waking up for the first time." Clarissa swallowed hard, her fingers gripping Mathew's sleeve. "1 hour," she whispered again, almost pleading. Mathew turned to her, his defenses cracking under the weight of her voice. "Every Thursday," she added, echoing Carlo's words. The silence stretched. Then Mathew sighed, each breath heavier than the last. "Fine," he said finally. 1 hour. Every Thursday. But there will be conditions." Carlo's expression didn't change. "I expected nothing less." Mathew took a step forward, his voice low. "You touch them without my permission. It ends. You speak of me, of the past, of anything that happened between us. It ends. You do anything I don't like." He let the threat linger in the air. Carlo smirked faintly. "Then I suppose I'll have to be very polite." He picked up his hat and placed it over his heart. "Thank you, Maddie. You've made the right choice, though you'll hate yourself for admitting it." He turned toward the door, but paused halfway through. "Oh, and Maddie?" Mathew didn't respond, but Carlo continued anyway. "Debts like ours don't end with signatures. They end with understanding." When the door closed behind him, Clarissa released the breath she'd been holding. Mathew sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "What have I done?" he muttered. Clarissa touched his shoulder. "You might have just saved them," she said quietly. "Or doomed us all." That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Mathew stood at his office window, staring at the city below. His reflection in the glass looked older, more haunted than he remembered. On his desk sat the music box Carlo had left behind, still humming faintly. It played the same Sicilian lullaby, its rhythm steady, patient like time itself. And for the first time in years, Mathew didn't silence it. The Thursday air smelled like rain, but the sky held back. Carlo returned just after noon, exactly 1 week since the impossible. No driver, no entourage, just him, dressed in the same black suit with a case tucked beneath his arm. Not the music box this time, but something longer, older. He stepped through the gate like he belonged there now. No one stopped him. Clarissa met him on the back patio, barefoot in the grass, her hair loose and eyes alert. "They've been waiting," she said, without smiling. Carlo nodded, eyes scanning the space as though searching for ghosts. "So have I." From beneath the worn leather case, he pulled out a violin, its varnish cracked, strings freshly tuned. He cradled the instrument like something sacred. "My mother's," he explained softly. "She played it during blackouts in Palermo. When bombs fell, the bow never stopped." Clarissa watched him kneel again in the same patch of grass where the twins had first bloomed. "Do you think it'll work again?" she asked. Carlo looked up. "It's not the music that works. It's the feeling." The twins were already outside, seated cross-legged on a blanket in the sun, small and quiet, but no longer empty. They didn't react at first, just observed. But the moment Carlo drew the bow across the strings, a sound rose into the yard so warm, so alive, it seemed to make the air shimmer. A low, soulful tune, neither lullaby nor hymn, but something in between. The boys blinked in unison, their heads tilting toward the vibration. Carlo smiled and played again, slower this time. Liam tapped a single finger against his knee. Theodore mimicked him, a heartbeat later. Bravissimi, Carlo whispered. You hear it, don't you? You hear her in the wood. He closed his eyes and played again, a melody that rose like a question and fell like a sigh. Inside the house, two therapists stood in the upstairs observatory, silent as statues. They'd been invited under strict conditions, not to speak, not to intervene, only to observe. One of them, Dr. Keller, leaned forward until her breath fogged the glass. This shouldn't be possible, she whispered. Her colleague, Dr. May, didn't answer. Her eyes were full of tears. The twins clapped again, not perfectly in time, but earnestly. Liam's mouth opened, not for a cry, not for a word, but for a sound. A long, humming tone, steady and strange, like the first note of a forgotten language. Theodore followed, lips pursed, voice wobbly but sure. It wasn't speech, not yet, but it was expression. Carlo lowered the violin and spoke gently in Italian. Voce non è sempre parole, he said. Voice is not always words. Clarissa sat behind the boys now, tears streaming freely. She didn't wipe them. She let them fall like rain, finally reaching thirsty ground. The twins turned toward her and giggled, actual giggles, and reached out their hands. Mathew watched from the study window, half hidden by sheer curtains. His hand trembled around a crystal tumbler, the scotch inside forgotten. He couldn't stop staring. The man kneeling in his backyard, the man he once feared, was now holding his sons, hearts with a bow and a string. Why him? Mathew muttered under his breath. Why not me? The question hung in the room like smoke. The answer, unspoken, came from behind him. Maybe, Clarissa said softly, stepping into the doorway, because he isn't afraid to be seen. Mathew turned, startled. What does that mean? She shrugged, eyes never leaving the yard. You love from a distance. Carlo sits in the dirt. Mathew flinched. I've given them everything. Clarissa stepped closer. Except you. He wanted to argue, to list the therapists, the diets, the security, but he didn't. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had poured his love into systems, not moments. Into safety, not connection. Outside, the music shifted into something playful. Carlo plucked the strings now, bouncing the notes like footsteps. The twins responded by stomping their feet on the blanket, then erupting into laughter when Carlo mirrored them. They were communicating, no words, no signs, just rhythm and breath and joy. This is insane, one of the therapists whispered upstairs. It's like watching a garden bloom in real time. Clarissa walked out to join them again, sitting this time between her sons. She placed one hand on each of their backs and closed her eyes. Their laughter vibrated through her palms, into her bones. It felt like sunlight, like redemption. Carlo watched her quietly, then spoke in a voice meant only for her. They're not waiting for a cure, he said. They're waiting for someone to join them. Clarissa nodded. I see that now. Her voice cracked. Thank you. Carlo didn't answer. He returned to the violin, letting the bow glide across the strings once more. The song was different this time. Hopeful, almost triumphant. The twins danced in their own way, wobbly and small, but full of purpose. It was a kind of music therapy no institution could teach. No specialist could replicate. Inside, Mathew turned from the window, overwhelmed by the ache in his chest. It wasn't jealousy, it was grief. Not for what he had lost, but for what he'd never given. And what Carlo had done, without money, without equipment, was reach the part of his sons Mathew didn't know how to touch. Later that afternoon, Clarissa found Mathew in the hallway, hands buried deep in his pockets. You saw it, she said softly. He nodded, unable to speak. They're waking up, she added. And I think you're afraid of what that means. Mathew's voice was brittle. I'm afraid it means I was never enough. Clarissa's expression softened. They're not asking for enough. They're asking for real. She touched his hand gently. You still have time. He nodded slowly. Do I? Yes, she said, but only if you stop standing behind the glass. Outside, the boys sat curled beside Carlo, heads resting on his coat. He was telling them a story now, something about stars and ships and the sea. The violin rested beside him in the grass. Clarissa stepped out and knelt beside them, wrapping an arm around both boys. Carlo smiled. "Every Thursday," he said. "That's all I ask." Clarissa met his gaze. "You'll get it." Behind her, Mathew watched, unseen. For the first time, he didn't feel in control. And strangely, it felt like the beginning of something, not the end. As the sun dipped below the trees, the boys stood, unsteady but upright. They took 3 steps, together, toward Clarissa. Not perfect, but theirs. Carlo stood and looked toward the house, toward the shadows where Mathew stood watching. "They're blooming, Maddie," he said quietly. "But if you want to be part of the garden, you've got to step out of the tower." That night, Clarissa tucked the boys in while humming the same lullaby Carlo had played. The melody filled the nursery like a promise. Liam giggled in his sleep. Theodore murmured something that wasn't quite a word but sounded suspiciously close to Mama. Clarissa smiled through her tears. For the first time since they were born, she dared to believe the impossible might become real. And in the shadows of the hallway, Mathew stood listening. Not commanding, not controlling, just listening. Can love from a distance ever replace being fully present? Subscribe for the next part, where past debts surface and silence breaks in ways no one expects. It was a gray morning, the kind that made the marble of the Francis mansion feel colder than usual. Clarissa stood by the kitchen window, fingers curled around a warm ceramic mug, steam drifting up past her cheekbones. Outside, the lawn glistened with dew, untouched, perfect as always. But there was a subtle shift in the air, a gentleness that hadn't been there weeks ago. In the distance, she could hear the twins laughing, a sound that still felt too precious to take for granted. Carlo sat across from her at the table, black coffee in hand, the violin case resting quietly beside him. His fedora lay on the chair next to him, the only part of him that seemed out of place in this polished, sterile home. Clarissa studied him, his stillness, the way he made silence feel like presence instead of absence. "You're different," she said, almost to herself. "You don't move like a man who came from violence." Carlo smiled faintly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "That's because I didn't come from it. I walked into it." Clarissa tilted her head. "Willingly?" she asked. Carlo didn't answer at first. He sipped his coffee, eyes narrowing as though measuring the weight of the truth. "No one chooses the fire, Mrs. Francis," he said. "But some of us learn how to live in the smoke." He looked down at his hands, the knuckles scarred, the skin rough. "There was a time when I thought I could stay clean, but life has a way of dragging you into the places you swore you'd never go." Clarissa said nothing. She didn't need to. Carlo leaned forward, his voice dropping. "My cousin Luca," he began slowly, "was like a brother to me. We grew up on the same street in Palermo. When I came to America, he followed a year later. Smart kid, loved architecture. Said he wanted to build homes, not just inherit them." His fingers traced the rim of his cup. "He died in a building collapse. Concrete cracked like paper. They said it was the contractor's fault, but I know the name on the permits." Clarissa froze. A chill crawled up her spine. "Luca?" she echoed. "Luca Bianchi?" Carlo nodded once. Clarissa's stomach turned. "That was Mathew's project. Midtown Tower. He was still new then. They cut corners on inspections, I remember." Her voice trailed off, horror dawning in her eyes. Carlo didn't look at her. "It wasn't personal. Not to him. It was numbers on a spreadsheet. But to me?" He finally met her gaze. "It was a funeral in the rain. A mother with nothing left. A grave without a body." The words hit like bricks. Clarissa's hand trembled around her mug. "You came here for revenge," she whispered. "Didn't you?" Carlo shook his head slowly. "That was the plan, at first." He leaned back in his chair. "I watched Mathew rise. Watched him build and buy and bury his past under concrete and gold. I could have pulled him down. Could have made him suffer. But then I saw you. And later, your boys." His voice softened. "And I realized something." Clarissa's eyes were glassy now. "What?" she asked. Carlo's words were quiet but sharp. "I thought you might pay with blood, but life gave you something better. He paused, letting it sink in. Sons without voices. Clarissa flinched, the implication landing hard. Until now, he added gently. Until they began to remember how to live. Outside, the boys laughed again, chasing bubbles across the lawn with the nanny. Clarissa stared down at the table, her reflection warping in the glossy surface. Does he know? She asked, her voice hollow. Carlo didn't answer. Does Mathew know what his deal cost you? Still, no reply, just the soft clink of Carlo's spoon against the cup. Mathew did know. He stood in the hallway just beyond the archway, half hidden in shadow, heart pounding. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but once he heard Luca's name, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Guilt poured over him like ink spilled in water, staining everything he thought he'd kept clean. The things he'd buried, under contracts, under profit, under time, had clawed their way back. Clarissa's voice cracked through his thoughts. So why help us? Why help them? Carlo set his cup down gently. Because they didn't choose silence, it was inherited, like a curse passed down through ambition. He turned to her, eyes fierce now. I couldn't save Luca. But maybe I can save them from the man who tried to forget he ever mattered. Mathew stumbled backward, heart racing, breath shallow. He didn't hear the rest of the conversation. He didn't need to. The truth was already carved into his bones. Luca had died for his empire, and now the children who bore his name were suffering a silence born not of biology, but of legacy. That night, Mathew didn't eat, didn't speak. He wandered the halls like a ghost in his own mansion. Every corner reminded him of what he'd built and what it had cost. Eventually, he found himself in the nursery. The room was dark, save for the glow of the nightlight shaped like a crescent moon. Liam stirred in his crib, one tiny arm flung over his stuffed giraffe. Theodore slept on his side, breathing slow and even. Mathew stepped in quietly, standing at the foot of their beds like a man approaching a shrine. His lips parted, and the words came out in a whisper, brittle and raw. I'm sorry. He sat on the edge of the rocker, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. I'm so sorry, he repeated. I didn't know. I didn't think. His voice cracked. You deserved better. You deserve better. He looked up at them, voice barely audible. I built all this so you'd never suffer, but I never saw that I brought the suffering in with me. He stayed there for a long time, listening to the sound of their breathing, letting the silence say everything his words couldn't. When Clarissa found him an hour later, he didn't look up. He told you, he said. She nodded, tears in her eyes. He did. Mathew didn't defend himself, didn't deflect. He should hate me. Clarissa stepped closer. Maybe he did, she said, but maybe he doesn't anymore. She knelt beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. He sees something in you. In them. Mathew let out a trembling breath. Do you? Clarissa took his hand and nodded. Yes, but only if you stop hiding from what you've done. She looked into the cribs. They need all of you, Mathew. Not the builder, not the protector. You! He nodded slowly, the tears finally coming. Then I'll give them that. I swear it. In the nursery nothing moved except the nightlight flickering gently. But something had shifted. Something real. And for the first time, Mathew Francis understood that redemption didn't come through silence, it came through confession. Thursday arrived with a strange stillness, like the hush before a symphony begins. No music box, no violin, just the sound of distant birdsong and the faint rush of wind through the trees. The staff had learned by now not to question Carlo Gambino's visits. They no longer asked if he had credentials. He had something far more commanding: presence. This time, he brought nothing with him. No instruments, no gifts, just himself. Clarissa watched from the patio, a coffee mug warming her hands, heart already racing. Mathew stood at the second-floor balcony, barely breathing, watching every movement like it might slip from him if he blinked. The twins were already outside, seated side by side on a soft wool blanket beneath the sycamore. They were fidgety today, restless but alert. Carlo paused just a few feet away and crouched low, letting the silence greet them first. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture. He just waited. Theodore noticed him first. His head turned like a compass needle, finding true north. Then Liam looked too, mouth parting in something that almost resembled a smile. The air shifted. Carlo opened his arms. Not wide, but just enough. An invitation, not a command. Without a word, the twins moved. Theodore pushed himself up, small knees trembling as he balanced upright for the first time without assistance. Beside him, Liam followed, slow but sure, his hands clenched into tiny fists of effort. They stood, wobbling, swaying like saplings in the wind. But they stood. Clarissa gasped, both hands flying to her mouth. The mug slipped from her fingers, shattering on the flagstone, but she didn't notice. Her eyes were locked on her sons, the boys who hadn't crawled, hadn't spoken, hadn't even reached for her, standing, unsteady, determined, alive. And then it happened. "Da-da," Theodore said, voice thin and high and broken. But clear, a single word, soft as mist and sharp as thunder. Mathew stumbled back from the railing as if struck. He gripped the stone edge for balance. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Carlo blinked slowly, his jaw tightening, not with surprise, but with reverence. The word had not been meant for Mathew. It had been spoken while reaching toward him, toward the man crouched in the dirt in a black suit, who had never asked for love but somehow received it anyway. "Dada?" Theodore repeated, stronger this time. Behind him, Liam took a halting step forward, then another, and a third. "Walk," Liam said, breathless and proud. Clarissa sank to her knees, sobbing. Mathew clutched the balcony rail, like it was the only thing keeping him from falling. He said, his voice cracked. He said, "Dada." Clarissa looked up through her tears, shaking her head. "But not to you," she whispered. "Not to us." Mathew collapsed against the stone, sliding down to his knees, eyes burning. The twins toddled forward and collapsed into Carlo's arms. Not because they were told, but because they wanted to. Carlo didn't speak. He simply held them, letting them bury their faces in the fabric of his coat. One hand rested on each boy's back, steady and firm. His eyes closed, and for a moment he looked not like a feared man, but like a man healed. Clarissa crawled forward, reaching them slowly, as though scared the moment might shatter. She cupped Theodore's face, kissed Liam's hair. "You did it," she whispered. "You did it." But her eyes were not on the boys. They were on Carlo, the man who had somehow given her children back to her. Behind them, one of the therapists peeked from the sliding doors. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers, forgotten. "That's not possible," she muttered. "They weren't supposed to." She didn't finish the sentence, because she no longer believed it. Mathew came down eventually, moving like a man walking into fire. Clarissa turned, expecting a storm, a confrontation, a collapse. But Mathew didn't yell, he didn't flinch. He dropped to his knees beside his wife and his sons, slowly, silently, and wept. The boys looked up, blinking at him, their connection to Carlo unbroken, but not exclusive. Liam reached out first, a hesitant hand brushing Mathew's collar. "Dada?" he asked again, testing the word. Not with rejection, not with certainty, but with curiosity. Mathew nodded, voice thick. "Yes," he choked out. "I'm your dada." His hands trembled as he placed one over Liam's. "And I'm sorry it took me so long to be here." Carlo watched all of it without speaking. Then, with deliberate grace, he stood. The boys turned toward him instinctively, as though drawn to his gravity. But Carlo gently nudged them back toward Mathew. "He needs this," he said softly in Italian. "So do you." The twins blinked, confused but compliant. Clarissa leaned in, hugging them close, anchoring the moment like a stone in water. Mathew held them too, both at once, as though terrified they'd slip away again. "You walked," he whispered. "You spoke." Carlo stepped back, slipping on his fedora, shadowing his expression once more. Clarissa looked up at him, eyes brimming. "Thank you isn't enough," she said. "Then don't say it," he replied. "Just keep listening. They'll tell you what they need." Mathew looked up at him too. No arrogance, no pride, just quiet awe. "How did you do this?" he asked. Carlo didn't answer, not directly, he simply nodded toward the grass. "By being with them, not above them." Clarissa helped the boys back onto the blanket while Mathew stood slowly, legs unsteady. "You'll be back next week?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. "Every Thursday," Carlo said, tipping his hat. "Until they no longer need me." He turned to go, but this time he didn't walk alone. The boys toddled after him, 3 steps each, then stopped. "Bye-bye," Liam called, waving. Theodore clapped, laughing. Carlo turned, his face finally breaking into a full, genuine smile. "Ciao, piccoli," he said. "Ci vediamo." Clarissa scooped them up, spinning them gently, her laughter joining theirs. Mathew watched, silent, undone, and in that golden yard, where silence once ruled like a tyrant, sound reigned. Not just speech. Life. That night, Clarissa tucked the boys into bed, their little fingers curled around soft blankets, lips still murmuring half-formed words in their sleep. Mathew sat in the rocker, staring at them like he was seeing them for the first time. "They called him Dada," he said again, voice small. Clarissa walked over and took his hand. "But they reached for you, Mathew." He looked at her, tears in his eyes. "You think I still have a chance?" She nodded. "They're just beginning to bloom. So are you." And outside, under the silver moonlight, Carlo Gambino paused at the gate, hand on the iron latch. He looked back once, toward the mansion, toward the voices drifting from open windows. He smiled. Some debts weren't paid in cash. They were paid in connection, in footsteps, in first words. In the moment a child finally reaches for the world, because someone knelt down and listened. If a child spoke their first word to someone else, would you feel jealous or grateful? Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe now. Sometimes the most powerful healing comes from the most unexpected hands. At first, it was just whispers among the staff, soft, cautious, reverent. "The twins, they're changing." The kind of change no doctor could take credit for. No one dared say it too loudly, as if speaking it aloud might break the magic. But it wasn't magic, it was presence. Mrs. Delaney, the longtime housekeeper, was the first to say what everyone else had been thinking. "They're not just awake now," she told the chef in the pantry one morning. "They're alive." In the nursery, the boys babbled back and forth, clapping along to songs Clarissa hummed without thinking. Sometimes Liam would say, again, pointing to the music box, and Theodore had a habit of whispering, "walk," before each wobbly journey across the room. The board of Francis Holdings was not as enthusiastic. "You did what?" demanded Harold Sinclair, one of Mathew's longest-serving advisors. "You fired the entire therapeutic team?" Mathew stood calmly at the head of the long glass table, voice even. "I didn't fire them. I released them." Harold scoffed. "For what? A violin-playing gangster?" Mathew's jaw tightened. "Carlo Gambino is my son's godfather, and from now on, he's their family companion." The words landed like a gavel. Silence spread across the room like wildfire. Another board member, Evelyn March, cleared her throat. "Mathew, the optics are none of your concern," he interrupted. "My sons walked, they spoke, and they did it because of him, not you." Behind closed doors, gossip churned. On the outside, Mathew's PR team tried to control the narrative, but Mathew had other plans. 2 days later, he stood before a sea of microphones, flanked by Clarissa, the twins, and one sharply dressed man in a black suit and fedora. Cameras clicked. Phones lit up. Reporters murmured. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mathew began, "this is Carlo Gambino." The room tensed like a wire pulled tight. "He is not a threat. He is not a scandal. He is my son's godfather." Carlo tilted his head slightly, a half-smile ghosting across his lips. "More importantly," Mathew continued, "he is the first man my children ever responded to." The room erupted with questions. Isn't he a known associate of organized crime? What about his record in Sicily? Why trust him with your children? Mathew didn't flinch. "Wealth built my empire," he said slowly, deliberately. "But connection built my sons." The microphones crackled. Silence fell again, not stunned, reverent. Clarissa stepped forward next, lifting Theodore onto her hip while Liam clung to Carlo's coat. "They were silent for a year," she said. "They didn't walk, didn't smile. Then one man knelt on the grass, and everything changed. Carlo said nothing, letting the parents speak. His power wasn't in his words, it was in what he made possible. Within hours, social media ignited. Hashtag Dada but not Daddy trended on Twitter. A side-by-side photo of Carlo crouched in the yard beside the twins versus Mathew on the balcony went viral with the caption, "One knelt, one watched." TikTok's remixed the moment Theodore said Dada with violin music. Debate raged. Was this redemption or recklessness? But behind the headlines, something else happened. Donations flooded into organizations for children with selective mutism. Therapists began rethinking their models. Families shared stories in comments. My daughter spoke for the first time to our neighbor's dog. You never know who the key will be. Clarissa stayed grounded through it all, refusing to let the circus cheapen the truth. She protected the boys from the attention. But she also let the story breathe, because maybe, just maybe, their story could help someone else. She invited parents of nonverbal children to tea. She shared her journals with a child psychologist who had long given up hope on his most challenging cases. The gala came 3 weeks later. Hosted in the city's largest event hall, it wasn't a fundraiser. It was a celebration. Titled, quote, Legacy Rewritten, the evening honored Liam and Theodore for simply becoming. The invitations read, from silence to song, from stillness to steps. Mathew stood on stage under soft lights. The twins nestled on either side of him, Clarissa glowing beside them. He cleared his throat, uncharacteristically nervous. I used to think legacy was made of buildings, of towers, of walls. He glanced at the boys. But now I know, legacy lives in footsteps. In first words. In the people we choose to kneel beside. Carlo stood off to the side, leaning against a pillar, watching with quiet pride. The twins spotted him from the stage. Liam waved. Theodore climbed down and toddled toward him, giggling. Carlo scooped him up without hesitation. Speech ready? He asked softly. Theodore grinned. Dada funny. The audience melted. Clarissa joined them, wrapping an arm around Carlo's back like he belonged there. And he did. Somehow. Against every odd, every warning, every fear, he belonged. By the end of the night, the twins had walked the full length of the ballroom, hand in hand with Carlo, little tuxedos wrinkled, shoes slightly too big. When they spoke, short, simple phrases like, thank you and we happy, people wept. Not because of what was said, but because of what it meant. Backstage, a journalist asked Mathew the question everyone had been waiting to ask. What's next for the Francis family? Mathew looked at his sons, now curled up asleep against Carlo's chest. Then at his wife, radiant, proud. We start over, he said. We build again. Not towers, not brands, bonds. That night, Clarissa tucked the boys into bed with soft lullabies and kisses to the forehead. Carlo lingered in the hallway, hat in hand. You staying for dinner next week? Clarissa asked with a wink. Every Thursday, Carlo replied. Until they tell me I'm not needed anymore. And even then, Clarissa thought, you always will be. Mathew watched them from the doorway, something unspoken, softening in his eyes. He stepped into the room, no longer just a builder or a benefactor. He was becoming a father, the kind who didn't just provide, but showed up. As the lights dimmed and the household settled into sleep, Carlo sat in the rocker between the cribs, one hand resting gently on each railing. The boys stirred, murmured, then fell deeper into dreams. Outside, the city glowed gold and silver. But in this house, legacy had found a new shape. Not in skyscrapers, but in the steps of two boys who once had no voice, now walking, laughing, and reaching for the man who taught them how. The sun spilled like honey over the Francis estate, warming the stone paths and stretching long shadows beneath the trees. The grass sparkled with dew, birdsong played in the distance, and for a moment, the world felt suspended, still, but not silent. In the yard, beneath the same sycamore where everything had begun, Carlo Gambino crouched once more, arms open, his black suit sharp against the morning gold. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The invitation was clear. From the back patio, Liam and Theodore bolted forward, squealing in unison. Carlo, Theodore shouted, the name crisp and certain. We brought you something? Liam added, clutching a paper flower made of yellow tissue. Their legs no longer wobbled. Their voices no longer trembled. They ran with purpose, laughter tumbling out of their mouths like confetti. Carlo braced himself as they crashed into his arms, two bundles of energy and light. Nothing like the silent statues he first met. Oof, he grunted with mock exaggeration, falling back onto the grass. You boys are getting heavier, Liam grinned. That's 'cause we eat now. And we grow, Theodore chimed in. Carlo tousled their hair with one hand, his smile full, his heart quiet. From the balcony above, Mathew watched the scene unfold. No glass separated him now, no doubt, just the quiet ache of realization blooming fully. For weeks, he had watched his sons become people, speaking, walking, laughing, being. And now, standing above them, Mathew finally understood something he hadn't before. Connection wasn't something you enforced, it was something you earned. He made his way down slowly, his footsteps measured, the weight of the past trailing behind him like a long shadow. Clarissa was already in the garden, setting up a blanket for their morning picnic, smiling as she hummed an old Sicilian tune under her breath. Mathew paused just a few feet from Carlo, his son still tangled in the man's arms. You don't bring anything anymore, he said gently. No violin, no music box. Carlo looked up, amusement flickering in his eyes. They bring themselves now, he said simply. That's all they ever needed. The twins nodded. We make our own songs now, Liam said proudly. Want to hear one? Always, Carlo replied. They stood, all four of them, in a circle of light, and Mathew finally stepped forward. He waited for a beat, then extended his hand toward Carlo. The moment hovered, electric and fragile. Carlo looked at it, then shook it. Not as a formality, as a recognition. I was wrong, Mathew said, his voice low. About everything, Carlo tilted his head. Even about yourself? Mathew nodded. Especially about myself. He glanced down at his boys. And what it means to build something real. Carlo's grip tightened just briefly, then loosened. You repaid me, he said. Not with riches. He stepped back, looking at the mansion behind them, then at the twins chasing butterflies across the grass. But with redemption. Clarissa joined them, the blanket spread out now, juice boxes and crackers already arranged. She kissed both boys on the forehead, her smile wide and grounded. We're having a party, Theodore declared. Just us. You're invited, Liam added, tugging on Carlo's pant leg. Only if you bring yourself. Carlo laughed. That I can manage. He lowered himself onto the blanket beside them, legs stretched out like a man at peace. Clarissa leaned against Mathew's side, her head on his shoulder. We're different now, she said quietly. Not better, not perfect, just honest. Mathew exhaled. And present, he added. Finally, he knelt beside his sons, reached for the flower Liam had made. This for me? Liam nodded. You and Carlo, you're both dadas now. Mathew smiled. Really smiled. Then I guess we share everything. As the sun climbed higher, laughter filled the yard. No longer a miracle, but a norm. The boys built castles out of twigs and dreams. Clarissa hummed, soft and content. And Carlo, who had once carried vengeance like a weapon, now carried peace like a second skin. Later, as the twins dozed on the grass, curled up between their parents and their godfather, Mathew broke the silence. You taught them how to speak, he said, watching their chests rise and fall. Carlo didn't answer at first. He simply looked down at the boys, his voice gentle when it came. No, he said. I just listened long enough to hear what they'd been trying to say all along. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.